Welcome back to The Deep Dive, the show dedicated to giving you the fastest possible route to intellectual fluency in the world's most complex subjects.
And today, we are strapping in for a conceptual thrill ride. We're going straight into the world of political philosophy.
It's the field that underpins everything, isn't it? From
Yeah.
the most basic municipal traffic law all the way up to the highest international treaties.
Absolutely. And we're opening with this really powerful idea that humans don't just sort of inherit their governmental system.
No, we actively shape them.
We do. We engage in this continuous, often very contentious debate about how society should work.
Exactly. And you shared some truly fantastic, dense, foundational material that covers the conceptual bedrock of politics. I mean, the actual blueprints for governance. So our mission today is crystal clear. We are going to distill those essential concepts, map out the major ideological schools of thought, and, fundamentally understand the core values that truly guide political action.
Think of this as your advanced glossary, but with analysis.
Yeah, so you can walk into any debate knowing the theoretical foundations.
And this is a really crucial deep dive because it distinguishes between description and prescription. Political philosophy is, at its heart, a normative field.
Okay, what do we mean by normative?
It doesn't just describe how governments actually work. That's the realm of political science.
Right, political science is more empirical.
Yeah.
It's the data.
Exactly, it's description. Political philosophy focuses on the desirable norms and values. It deals with the shoulds.
The ideal forms.
Precisely. It explores concepts like justice, equality, and liberty, not just how they manifest, but how they ought to manifest.
So our scope today is pretty vast.
It is. We have to look at the nature, the reach, the very legitimacy of political institutions, and we're tackling these fundamental questions about the individual's relationship to the collective, and maybe most critically, how goods and power should be distributed across society.
You're really aiming for intellectual fluency in the deepest theoretical disagreements facing humanity.
That's the goal.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we dive into the heavy hitters like anarchism and liberalism, we really need a shared, precise vocabulary.
Toolkit.
A toolkit. Let's start with a distinction that I think often confuses people. Political philosophy versus political theory. They get used interchangeably all the time. Is there a real dividing line?
There is a subtle one, but it's important for scholars. Political philosophy, it tends to seek answers to the really big, general, perennial questions.
The kind that go all the way back to Plato.
Exactly. What is the best life for a citizen?
Right.
What is true justice? It's often very abstract, very foundational.
The ultimate big picture questions.
Right. Whereas political theory can be seen as a sister discipline that, might focus on clarifying specific operational concepts for political scientists.
So more applied.
A bit more applied, yeah. It might analyze something like voter apathy or the practical implications of a certain constitutional amendment. But really, both fields rely on the fundamental concepts we're about to discuss, starting with the absolute prerequisite for politics, the state.
The state. It's the defining feature of political organization, but what is the philosophical definition we need to be working with?
That's most basic. The state is an organized political entity. It's an association of people, citizens, exercising control over specific territory and implementing the rule of law.
Okay, that's the textbook definition.
But philosophers tend to characterize the state in one of two major ways, and this split immediately reveals the core tension in all of political thought.
All right, give us the two poles.
So the first one, you could argue it's the most cynical, sees the state as a necessary evil. It focuses on its most essential feature, the monopoly on violence.
The monopoly on violence.
This characterization emphasizes coercion. It's about the subordination of the will of the many to a dominant few who maintain order through force, or, the threat of force.
That sounds dark. It's all about fear and control.
It is. It's the perspective you find heavily in realists like Machiavelli or Hobbes. But the alternative, more optimistic view sees the state as a social contract.
Established for mutual benefit and security.
Exactly. This view focuses on cooperation, on consent, and on the idea that individuals voluntarily surrender some freedoms to gain collective protection and stability. The entire framework of classical liberalism is built on this second idea.
Wow. So whether you view the state as fundamentally coercive or fundamentally cooperative, that dictates almost your entire political outlook.
It's a huge fork in the road. And we also need to distinguish the state from a few related concepts.
Like stateless societies.
Right. Stateless societies are just loosely ordered social groups without a central authority. Then you have the nation, which is a group of people sharing a common identity, culture, language, history.
And when those two things line up.
When that national identity aligns neatly with the state's political boundaries, you get the powerful and often volatile entity known as the nation-state.
So if the state is the political entity with borders and sovereignty, the government is the institution that sits inside it, operating the machinery.
Exactly. The government is the operational institution exercising control. And philosophically, there's an interesting distinction here, too.
Which is?
Some thinkers see government as an end in itself, like intrinsically valuable. Others see it purely as a means to an end.
Like peace, security, or prosperity.
Right. And many modern governments, recognizing the inherent danger of concentrated power, establish a constitution to outline their structure and, critically, their limitations.
And this is where the real constraint on power comes into play, isn't it?
It's the stabilization device. A constitution stabilizes the exercise of power, prevents arbitrary rule, and legitimizes governance while, in theory, safeguarding fundamental rights.
Which leads us directly to the concepts that make or break any political system, power and legitimacy. So let's define them clearly. What are we talking about when we talk about power?
In political philosophy, power is the ability to produce intended effects, to control what people and institutions do. And it's multifaceted.
Is that just brute force?
No. It can be based on consent. Think of the power of a charismatic leader people willingly follow. Or it can be based on coercion, like a tyrannical ruler.
So power is the raw ability to make things happen. But what determines if that power is justified? If we have a moral obligation to obey it?
That's legitimacy, the rightful or justified use of power. It's not enough to have power. You must have the right to wield it.
And how do you get that right?
Well, typically it needs to meet two criteria. It has to be acquired through established, accepted rules, like a fair election, and it has to be used for rightful, publicly accepted ends, like protecting the citizens.
So when a government loses legitimacy, even if it still has power,
it faces a crisis. Exactly. This is closely tied to authority, which is often defined as the right to rule, or the common belief that someone is legitimized to exercise power.
That's a crucial nuance.
It is. You can have authority, the accepted right to rule, without the immediate power to enforce it. And a tyrant has immense power, but zero legitimacy or moral authority.
Okay, that makes sense. So if we look at how different governments wield this power, legitimate or not, we get this huge spectrum of forms of government. Let's quickly run through the major ones.
We can distinguish them based on who holds the power. The ideal, for many, where power resides with the people, is democracy.
And even that has layers. You have direct democracy, where citizens vote on everything themselves.
Which is pretty rare outside of, say, a small community or a specific referendum.
Right. And then you have the indirect or representative model, which is what most of us are familiar with, where we elect leaders to make decisions for us.
Then you have the direct opposite, authoritarian regimes. These systems reject political plurality and suppress dissent.
And under that umbrella, you have autocracies,
where a single person holds absolute power, a monarch or a dictator.
And oligarchies,
where power is concentrated in the hands of a small, wealthy group.
And at the most extreme end of that spectrum is totalitarianism.
Yes. Totalitarianism is an authoritarian regime that seeks extensive control over everything, public and private life. A critical subtype is fascism, which adds this powerful nationalist and militarist ideology to the mix.
And beyond who holds the power, governments can also be categorized by the type of people making decisions.
Right. Rule by expertise or status. So you have aristocracy, rule by the elites or nobility.
Meritocracy, if those elites are chosen by skill and merit.
Technocracy, if it's technical experts like scientists and engineers. And of course, theocracy, where religious authority rules.
This all naturally leads to a key philosophical insight, which is the need to prevent the abuse of all this concentrated power. The mechanism for that is the separation of powers.
The genius of institutional design, popularized by Montesquieu.
Legislative, executive, and judicial. Why is this division so critical?
It's based on the historical reality that power corrupts. If you concentrate all three functions, making the laws, enforcing the laws, and judging who broke the laws in one body, that body becomes absolute.
Instant tyranny.
Pretty much. By forcing them to operate independently and to check each other's power, you make arbitrary rule much more difficult.
That system of constraint is enforced through laws. But even there, we have a huge philosophical split on where laws get their authority.
We do. On one hand, you have natural law theory.
The idea that laws should reflect some kind of universal morality.
Exactly, that there are moral principles inherent in human nature, and unjust law isn't really a law at all.
And this contrasts sharply with legal positivism,
which views laws strictly as human conventions. For a positivist, if a law was passed according to the established rules, it's a valid law, regardless of whether we think it's moral or not.
Wow. So that's the whole philosophical debate over our political obligation, our duty to follow the law, even when we think it's wrong.
That's what politics meets ethics right there.
We've established the framework of the state and its rules. Now let's talk about what the state is actually for.
Yes, the ultimate normative values that drive political action: justice, equality, and liberty.
Let's start with justice. It's this huge, complex concept, but how do philosophers break it down?
We generally look at three types. First, there's social justice. This is the big picture fairness in how wealth, assets, and advantages are distributed across society.
Is the system itself fair?
That's the question. And within that, you have the practical side, distributive justice.
This is about the impartial allocation of resources. Should everyone get an equal slice, or should it be based on need or merit?
Exactly. This is the philosophical foundation for real-world policy battles like progressive taxation.
Right. And then separately, in the legal context, we have retributive justice,
which is all about punishment. The idea that the punishment should be proportional to the crime just deserts.
And this brings us to John Rawls, whose theory, justice is fairness, is one of the most influential modern ideas in this whole field.
It is. Rawls was trying to find a way to establish truly impartial principles of justice, so he proposed a thought experiment, the original position.
Right, behind a veil of ignorance. What does that mean?
You imagine a group of rational people getting together to design their future society. The veil of ignorance is that they don't know who they will be in that society.
You don't know your race, gender, intelligence, wealth.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Nothing. You're forced to be completely impartial, so you're not going to choose rules that favor the rich because you might end up being poor.
That's a profound idea. It forces you to step outside your own self-interest.
And Rawls argued that from this position, people would choose two principles. First, equal basic liberties for everyone, and second, the difference principle.
Which says
that social and economic inequalities are only okay if they benefit the least advantaged members of society. It makes justice inherently about fairness to the most vulnerable.
Justice is so closely linked to equality. But as you mentioned, there are many ways to define equal.
Philosophers map these out really rigorously. The most fundamental is equality before the law.
Same legal standards for everyone.
Then you have political equality, the ability to vote and run for office. These two are pretty widely accepted in modern liberal states.
But the real fights start with equal opportunity.
Yes. The ideal that success should be based purely on merit and effort, not on the circumstances of your birth. The government's role, in this view, is to level the playing field.
And the more radical goal is equality of outcome.
Right. This argues that all people should end up with similar levels of material wealth and living standards. This is the goal of egalitarianism. And the tension between equal opportunity and equal outcome is, well, it's one of the defining arguments of modern politics.
Shifting gears to liberty or freedom, there's a distinction here that you said defines the split between classical and modern political thought.
Yes, Isaiah Berlin's famous dichotomy, negative liberty versus positive liberty.
Okay, break that down for us.
Negative liberty is pretty straightforward. It's the absence of external obstacles. It's freedom from. The state protects you from theft, from aggression, from interference.
Like freedom of speech. The government can't stop you from talking.
Exactly. Positive liberty, on the other hand, is the power or the capacity to act. It's freedom too.
So freedom to go to college or freedom to start a business, things that require resources.
Precisely. Positive liberty suggests that a starving, uneducated person isn't truly free, even if they have all their negative rights, because they lack the capacity to achieve their goals.
And that sets up the major political dilemma.
It does. Does the law necessarily limit negative liberty, or does it enable positive liberty by funding things that empower citizens? That is the ultimate trade-off.
We now have the complete toolkit, the concepts of state, power, justice, and liberty. It's time to see how different ideologies tie these together into coherent political visions.
Yes, the blueprints. We're going to focus on 4 major schools: anarchism, conservatism, liberalism, and socialism, that interpret these values in radically distinct ways.
Let's start with anarchism. It's often dismissed as just pure chaos, but philosophically it's a profound commitment to liberty and equality.
That's the core. It rejects hierarchical systems and centralized coercive government power. It proposes a stateless society driven by voluntary cooperation.
They see authority itself as the problem?
A threat to individual autonomy, a perpetuator of power imbalances. For many anarchists, the state is basically a criminal organization.
And there's a spectrum of rejection here, right? It's not all or nothing.
We can distinguish between absolute anarchism, which says the state is always morally wrong, and contingent anarchism,
Which is more pragmatic.
Yeah, it argues that states aren't inherently illegitimate in theory, but they always fail in practice. They always lead to corruption, war, and inequality.
And the focus shifts dramatically based on whether you prioritize the individual or the community in this stateless model.
Precisely. You have individualist anarchists, which includes the modern version anarcho-capitalism.
Or libertarian anarchism.
Right. They stress the absolute primacy of individual freedom and private property. They envision a society run on voluntary contracts and private defense agencies.
And the counter-tradition
is collectivist or socialist anarchism. They stress community, cooperation, and the collective ownership of resources. For them, true freedom can't exist if economic power is concentrated in private hands.
What are the major criticisms of anarchism as a practical blueprint?
Well, the main one is that it's unstable and just leads to chaos. That rejecting institutions creates a power vacuum and the strongest just take over.
And the utopian critique.
That it relies on an unrealistic view of human nature, that we're all just naturally selfless and cooperative, which history might suggest otherwise.
Okay. Moving to a school of thought rooted entirely in the past, we have conservatism, often associated with Edmund Burke.
Its core tenet is the preservation of traditional institutions and practices. It's driven by a deep skepticism of our ability to radically reform society for the better.
So the argument is that institutions like family, religion, common law, they represent the accumulated wisdom of generations.
They've passed the test of time. Drastic changes, guided by abstract theories, often destroy these valuable foundations and cause more harm than good.
So it's not strictly anti-change, but anti-radical, ideological change. They prefer gradual evolution.
Exactly. The focus is on prudence. And while the specific traditions might change from place to place, conservatives generally emphasize family, religion, national identity, and strong support for private property.
And they see private property as a safeguard against state power.
Yes, and as a pillar of stability.
What are the main philosophical criticisms of the conservative framework?
The primary one is that its resistance to change can stifle necessary social progress. By prioritizing the status quo, it can perpetuate deep-seated problems like systemic injustice.
And that it tends to reinforce established hierarchies.
Right, benefiting privileged classes by arguing for tradition when that tradition might be structurally unfair.
Let's turn now to liberalism, arguably the most successful political philosophy of the last 3 centuries, rooted in thinkers like John Locke.
Its core tenet is prioritizing individual liberties and rights, supported by the rule of law, tolerance, and constitutional democracy. It's grounded in a real optimism about human nature.
The belief in our capacity for rationality and self-determination.
Absolutely. The idea is that individuals are born free and equal, with natural rights. The government's main job is to protect those rights.
Yeah.
And economically, this almost always translates into support for some form of capitalism.
A free market economy.
Right. But here we have to return to that great divide we talked about, based on negative versus positive liberty.
This is the split between classical and modern liberalism.
Exactly. Classical liberalism wants a very limited state. It focuses almost exclusively on negative liberty protecting individuals from government interference.
The night watchman state.
The night watchman state. Its resurgence today is often called neoliberalism. The counter-evolution is modern liberalism.
Which is more aligned with social democracy.
Right. Modern liberals argue that purely negative freedom isn't enough. They emphasize positive liberty. They believe the state must take an active role in fostering the conditions, like education and healthcare, that allow everyone to achieve their potential.
The sources also highlight libertarianism as being closely related to classical liberalism, almost like its philosophical extreme.
It is. Libertarianism emphasizes the non-aggression principle above all else. They want to limit government strictly to defense, police, and contract enforcement, and they disapprove of almost all wealth redistribution.
Finally, we come to socialism, a complex family of views focused on collective ownership and equality.
Yes, offering a fundamental critique of that liberal capitalist arrangement. The core idea is that the means of production, factories, land, major resources should belong to the people in general, or the workers, social ownership.
Their main motivation is creating structural equality.
Right. They're highly critical of how capitalism leads to huge accumulations of private wealth, which they see as reinforcing unjust class systems.
And of course, the most influential school within socialism is Marxism. We need to clarify what Marx actually argued.
Marxism offers a systematic analysis of history and economics. It centers on the idea of historical materialism, that economic forces drive history and society is defined by class struggle.
And for Marx, in capitalist society, that struggle is between
the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie who own the means of production, and the working class, the proletariat who have to sell their labor. He argued this relationship is inherently exploitative and leads to alienation.
And he predicted this would eventually lead to a transition state.
Which brings us to the crucial distinction in his theory between socialism and communism. For Marx, socialism is the intermediate stage after capitalism.
The dictatorship of the proletariat.
Right. It's still centralized, still has a state managing resources. The principle is from each according to his ability to each according to his contribution.
And communism is the final stage.
Correct. The stateless, classless, final stage. It's characterized by material abundance and self-organization without a central government. The principle there is from each according to his ability to each according to his needs.
What are the main criticisms leveled against the socialist framework, especially that centralized model?
Well, economically, critics argue that central planning is massively inefficient. Without market signals like prices, you get poor resource allocation and stagnation. This is the calculation problem.
And philosophically?
Liberal critics argue that egalitarian redistribution fundamentally violates individual rights, especially the right to property, and that the massive state required for it can create its own new, powerful, bureaucratic hierarchies.
It's clear that political thought doesn't fit neatly into just those four boxes. Let's look at some other key tensions, like realism versus idealism.
This is a fundamental dichotomy, especially in foreign policy. Realism, which we associate with Machiavelli, asserts that politics is just driven by self-interest and the pursuit of power.
Pragmatism over morality.
Yes. Idealism, in contrast, asserts that political action should follow universal moral principles, like justice and human rights, to establish a fair social order.
Another framework is consequentialism or utilitarianism.
This is the idea that the moral value of an action depends entirely on its consequences. Classical utilitarianism argues the goal of politics should be to produce the highest overall happiness for the largest number of people.
Which can be a problem if it means sacrificing the rights of a minority for the good of the majority.
That's the key philosophical problem with it, yes.
This brings us to another deep conflict: the individual versus the community.
The battle between individualism and communitarianism. Individualism, which you see in liberalism, prioritizes the individual. Communitarianism, on the other hand, supports strong social relationships and shared values.
They would argue that without a strong community, the individual lacks meaning.
Exactly. That policies should foster public virtues and a shared life, even if that sometimes restricts pure individual liberty.
So how do philosophers actually decide which of these competing shoulds is the best way to organize society? What's the methodology?
It's a huge challenge. You can't run a lab experiment for justice, but they use rigorous logical frameworks. One is foundationalism, a top-down approach.
Start with a few basic principles and build a whole system from there.
Yes. Like Thomas Hobbes, who started with the premise that human nature is brutish and selfish, and from that, he justified the need for an absolute state to maintain order.
And the alternative, bottom-up approach,
is particularism. You start with individual moral intuitions about specific situations, like it's wrong for someone to hoard food while others starve, and then you try to build a coherent theory from those judgments.
It's vital to remember that this entire tradition is rooted in antiquity. These debates are not new.
Not at all. Plato and Aristotle were defining the field 2,500 years ago, and the roots are global, far beyond the Western canon.
You have Confucianism in ancient China, emphasizing humaneness and benevolence.
And the mystical tradition of Taoism, which is sometimes associated with anarchism because of its skepticism of coercive authority.
And the opposing school of legalism, a purely realist philosophy of strict laws and punishments. It shows these conceptual challenges have preoccupied thinkers across all major civilizations for millennia.
So, we have completed our intensive deep dive into the theoretical foundations of political philosophy. We've outlined that essential toolkit, the concepts of state, power, legitimacy, and explored the guiding values of justice, equality, and liberty.
And crucially, we mapped the ideological blueprints that try to implement these values: anarchism, conservatism, liberalism, and socialism. The tension between these ideas is what defines our modern political discourse.
And we spent time on the methodology thinkers use, specifically that powerful intellectual device from John Rawls, the original position behind a veil of ignorance.
And that leads perfectly to our final provocative thought for you to chew on. Rawls forces us to confront our own biases.
It does.
If you truly had to define the core principles of a government without knowing your own place within it, without knowing your wealth, class, race, gender, or abilities, what fundamental institutions would you demand and why?
Think about it. Would you prioritize absolute negative liberty, knowing you might be born poor and unable to afford basic needs? Or would you demand a robust welfare state, ensuring positive liberty for everyone, knowing you might be the wealthy person who has to fund it?
Your answer reveals your deepest philosophical priorities.
It really does.
Think on that. That's the ultimate goal of political philosophy, designing the ideal society. You've just gotten the shortcut to understanding the blueprints. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
Okay, let's just dive right in. What happens when the sun decides to throw a punch? And I don't mean just a little jab. I'm talking a full-on solar haymaker aimed directly at Earth.
It's really the ultimate collision, isn't it? It's where just the overwhelming, terrifying beauty of the cosmos clashes violently and completely unexpectedly with the fragile infrastructure we've built.
And that's exactly what we're talking about today. We are doing a deep dive into the benchmark for all solar catastrophes, the Carrington event of 1859.
And it is quite the benchmark. This is, to this day, the most intense geomagnetic storm in recorded history.
Right. It all went down on September 1st and 2nd, 1859, during what astronomers call solar cycle 10. And the intensity was, it wasn't just causing a few glitches.
No, it was literally igniting fires in telegraph stations.
That's the part that always gets me. Fires.
And that contrast is really the key to this whole deep dive.
Yeah.
Because back in 1859, the technological impact was, it was localized. It was confined to a very new, very basic telegraph system.
A few sparks, a few melted wires. A big deal for them, I'm sure, but ultimately fixable.
Exactly. A repairable crisis. But if an event of that same magnitude were to happen today, the consequences would just balloon. It would go from a localized problem to a multi-trillion-dollar global systemic crisis almost overnight.
Okay, so that sets our mission for this deep dive perfectly. We're going to jump into the source material you brought and really unpack 3 critical things about this solar monster.
First, we have to look at the specific historical moment of its discovery, the stunning immediate impacts. Auroras that wrap the entire world in light and the chaos it caused for the new telegraph lines.
Then second, we need to get into the physics, the surprising and frankly terrifying reason why the storm was so unbelievably fast and so violent. It completely changes how much warning time we might have.
And finally, we have to confront the modern threat, the really high-stakes financial and societal projections. We'll look at why a Carrington-class event today isn't just a threat to power grids, but to everything, even our food supply.
So 1859 wasn't just some historical curiosity.
Not at all. It was a warning shot. It was the moment the sun almost ended the world as they knew it.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. The moment of discovery. Because this didn't just set a benchmark for intensity, it fundamentally changed how we view the sun-Earth connection.
Before 1859, mainstream science really just saw the sun as a predictable source of light and heat. a constant. The idea that a sudden visual event happening 93 million miles away could instantly affect instruments here on the ground.
That was fringe theory, right?
Borderline. It was speculative, to say the least.
And then on September 1st, 1859, two British astronomers working completely independently, they gave us the first hard evidence that the sun was way more volatile than we thought.
Yes, Richard Carrington and Richard Hodgson. And the story around Carrington's observation is just legendary. He was at his private observatory sketching this very large, very complex group of sunspots.
Sunspots being those cooler, darker, magnetically active spots on the surface?
Exactly. And just before noon, he sees it. An intensely bright, just a blinding white light erupting right near that sunspot group.
The visual signature of a massive explosion, what we'd now call a solar flare.
Precisely. And we have his sketches. They actually document this bright event moving across the sunspot group. He labeled it moving from positions A and B to C and D within about 5 minutes. Then it just vanished.
So that's the moment the energy is released, the fuse is lit.
That's the moment. And that flare hurled a massive bubble of plasma and magnetic field, what we call a coronal mass ejection, or a CME, directly toward Earth.
But the connection, that cause and effect, wasn't immediately obvious, was it, even to him?
Well, here's where it gets really interesting. At the exact same time Carrington saw the flare, a Scottish physicist named Balfour Stewart was at the Kew Observatory near London, and he was recording Earth's magnetic field.
With a magnetometer.
Right. And at that exact moment, his instrument recorded a tiny but distinct, sharp little jump in the magnetic record.
The so-called magnetic crochet.
That's it. That tiny little wiggle was the first piece of hard evidence. The light and radiation from the flare arrived in just minutes, hit our atmosphere, and caused a subtle jolt in Earth's magnetic field. It was like the universe providing proof of concept.
Incredible. One event, two completely different observations. One visual, one magnetic happening at the same time.
But they were cautious scientists. Carrington suspected this flare was the cause of the monster geomagnetic storm that arrived the next day, but he was very reserved about it.
Right, he used that famous phrase, "One swallow does not make a summer."
He did. He knew he needed more than a single coincidence, no matter how compelling it was.
So who was it that finally connected all the dots?
That would be the American mathematician Elias Loomis. He did the really painstaking work of compiling reports from all over the world, magnetic disturbances, telegraph failures, and of course those incredible auroral displays.
And he cross-referenced everything against Carrington's timing.
He did. And his work really solidified that solar-terrestrial connection. It's foundational to our modern understanding of space weather.
Okay, so the flare is seen on September 1st. The massive particle storm, the full punch, arrives and peaks on the 2nd. This brings us to the speed of the thing, which is where this shifts from a cool historical event to a terrifying modern threat.
Absolutely. The speed is the single most critical factor here. A CME is this huge bubble of solar plasma and magnetic fields, and it gets ejected at millions of miles per hour.
And how long does that 150 million kilometer journey usually take?
Typically several days. 3, maybe 5 days to reach Earth. That's the transit time our current forecasting models are based on.
Because it's pushing through all the other stuff out there, the ambient solar wind.
Right, that solar wind plasma acts like a kind of cosmic drag. It slows it down.
At the Carrington CME, it didn't play by those rules.
Not even close. The record shows it made that entire 93 million mile journey in a mere 17.6 hours.
Less than a day. That is horrifyingly fast. If we only get 17 hours of warning today, that basically collapses any window we have for mitigation. So how? How was it so fast?
The leading theory is what we call the clearing the way hypothesis. It suggests that the path was essentially cleared for it by an earlier solar event.
Like a cosmic snowplow came through first.
That's a perfect analogy.
Wow.
We know there was another earlier solar eruption a few days before. It's likely the one that caused a big aurora event on August 29th. That first CME traveled out, and it swept away most of that ambient solar wind plasma, that cosmic friction, along the path to Earth.
So the space right in front of the main event was basically a vacuum.
A much less dense medium, exactly. So when the real monster, the Carrington CME, launched on September 1st, it hit significantly less drag. It was able to maintain this incredibly high velocity the whole way here. It just served a cleared lane right to our doorstep.
And you see the force of that impact in the magnetic data in something called the Drest index. The source material said it was between over 0.80 and 1.75 microteslas. Can you put that number in context for us?
Right, so the Drake, or Disturbance Storm Time Index, It measures the severity of a geomagnetic storm. A normal day is around 0. When a big CME hits, it compresses our magnetic field, and the trace number goes negative.
So the more negative, the worse the storm.
Precisely. A severe storm today might drop to, say, minus 100 nanoteslas. The Carrington event was estimated to be as strong as minus 1750 nanoteslas.
It's just off the charts.
Completely off the charts. It's the physical proof that Earth's protective magnetic bubble was just violently compressed and completely overwhelmed. A monster hit us, and we only had about 17 hours to see it coming.
Which paints this picture of a planet just caught completely off guard by a perfectly timed solar attack. So now we move from the physics to the surreal and unforgettable impact it had right here on the ground. When that superfast CME hit, Earth's magnetosphere basically screamed, and the sky put on a light show that has never been equaled since.
The historical records of the auroras from this event are just. They're the most evocative part of the story. And we have to use the word global in its truest sense here. The auroras, both the northern and southern lights, were seen way beyond their usual polar regions.
And this is the part to really emphasize. We're talking about places incredibly close to the equator, places that never, ever see the aurora.
Absolutely. The records show sightings in south-central Mexico, Cuba, Hawaii, even as far south as Colombia, which is practically on the equator.
Can you imagine seeing the Arctic lights over the palm trees in Havana? It must have felt like the world was ending.
It wasn't just in the north either. In the south, you had the aurora australis seen all across Queensland, in Australia, southern Japan, China, New Zealand. For anyone living in that equatorial band, it must have felt like a fundamental violation of the natural order of the sky.
And the light wasn't just geographically widespread, it was intensely bright. We have these amazing anecdotes that really paint a picture. The one about the Rocky Mountain gold miners is my favorite.
It's such a relatable example. They woke up in the middle of the night, saw the glow, and genuinely thought it was morning.
So they got up and started making breakfast.
They did. The reports say the glow over their camps was so bright, so pervasive, they mistook it for dawn. They started preparing meals, getting their gear ready for the day. That tells you the ambient light was brighter than a full moon.
And we see that confirmed back east, too. In the northeastern U.S., people could apparently read a newspaper just by the light of the aurora alone. This wasn't a faint shimmer.
No, it was a functioning, natural streetlight. The Baltimore newspaper report from September 3rd, 1859 gives this beautiful description. They said the light was more brilliant and the prismatic hues more varied and gorgeous.
Greens, reds, purples, a whole light show.
Yes, and they said it covered the whole firmament, apparently like a luminous cloud. But here's the key sensory detail for me. They said the light was greater than a full moon, but had an indescribable softness and delicacy.
So it wasn't harsh. It was this powerful but gentle luminous blanket that turned midnight into twilight.
Which must have been both wondrous and deeply unsettling. We also have this incredible account from an Australian gold miner, C.F. Herbert. He wrote about it 50 years later, in 1909.
50 years later. The fact he still remembered it so vividly tells you everything.
It does. He described looking out of his tent and seeing these streams of light of every imaginable color shooting up from the southern sky, all becoming a rich purple when they reached the top of the sky, the zenith. He called it a sight never to be forgotten.
And his account really captures that split reaction people had back then.
It does. He framed it as two groups. On one hand, you have the rationalists who saw nature in her most exquisite robes. They saw the science and the beauty in it.
And the other group?
The superstitious. For them, it brought dire forebodings. They thought it was a sign of Armageddon, the end of days. This wasn't just a physical event, it was a profound psychological one. The sky, the one thing that's supposed to be constant, was suddenly on fire.
It just shatters your perception of stability. Whether you see it through the lens of science or religion, it forces you to confront this immense, untamable power of the universe.
So while the auroras were this beautiful, apocalyptic spectacle, the real measure of the storm's power, and the real warning for us today, was the immediate failure of 19th century technology.
Which at the time was the telegraph system. This was the absolute cutting edge, the nervous system of early globalization. And when that CME hit, telegraphs across Europe and North America failed instantly.
And they failed because of something called geomagnetically induced current, or GIC. This is the real villain of the story for us today.
Right. Can you break that down? How does it work?
when all that solar plasma slams into our magnetosphere, it creates these huge electrical currents way up in the atmosphere. Those currents then induce secondary currents on the ground, and those currents look for the easiest path to travel.
The path of least resistance, which would be long metal conductors like power lines.
Or telegraph lines, or, and this is a key detail, even oil and gas pipelines.
Wait, pipelines too? How does that work?
Well, the Earth itself isn't a great conductor, but a long metal pipe is an excellent one. So that current can flow along the pipeline, and where it enters or exits the pipe, it can accelerate corrosion, potentially leading to breaches. It adds a whole other layer to the potential disaster.
Wow. Okay, so for the telegraphs in 1859, this GIC just completely overwhelmed their systems.
It flooded them. The accounts are dramatic. Operators reported getting painful electric shocks right from their telegraph keys. People saw sparks literally flying off the wooden telegraph pylons.
And even off the paper tape as messages were being printed. That's an incredible image, the whole system just spontaneously combusting.
It is. But inside all that chaos, we have one of the most amazing moments of scientific discovery in real time, the famous batteryless conversation.
This is the aha moment. So on the line between Boston and Portland, Maine, the operators figured something out.
They realized the induced current, the GIC, was so powerful they could actually use it. They managed to keep talking to each other without using their batteries at all. They were running purely on the aurora.
And we have the transcript of their conversation. The Boston operator basically says to the Portland operator, hey, cut your battery off.
And he does. And then Boston confirms, mine is disconnected and we are working with the auroral current. How do you receive my writing? They were powered by the solar storm itself?
The reply from Portland is amazing. Better than with our batteries on.
Better. He says the current comes and goes gradually, but it's a stronger, cleaner signal. They kept this up for 2 hours, transmitting messages using only the raw electricity generated by a solar storm 93 million miles away.
So by taking their own batteries offline, the signal actually got better.
It did. The Boston operator figured it out in real time. He noted the auroral current seemed to neutralize and augment our batteries alternately. Basically, their own power source was getting in the way of this much more powerful natural current.
It was the first time they'd ever transmitted more than a word or two that way. They accidentally tapped into a cosmic power plant.
And it was a huge lesson. In 1859, GIC was a novelty, a source of sparks. Today, that exact same phenomenon applied to our massive modern power grid is an existential risk.
Which brings us right to the modern threat. We have to contrast the limited damage of 1859 with the potential for absolute devastation a recurrence would cause today.
The difference is complexity and interdependence. In 1859, the telegraph going down was an inconvenience. Today, our entire civilization runs on electricity. Hospitals, finance, water treatment, the food supply. Everything depends on the grid.
So if a Carrington-class storm hits now, the GIC wouldn't just cause a few blackouts. It would flood the entire high-voltage distribution network. And the weakest link there are the big transformers.
Exactly. The high-voltage transformers. They're vulnerable because the GIC acts like a DC current being injected into an AC system. It pushes their magnetic cores into saturation. They start to heat up incredibly fast, and they can catastrophically fail. They can literally melt down.
And these are not something you can just go and replace easily.
Far from it. They're custom built, they weigh hundreds of tons, and it can take months, sometimes years, to manufacture and install a new one. A cascading failure of hundreds of these across a continent could mean blackouts that last for months, not days.
And we know this isn't just theory because we've had some very close calls. The closest was actually pretty recent, on July 23rd, 2012.
That 2012 event was, by every measure, a genuine Carrington-class storm. It had the flare, the high-velocity CME, the whole package. It was the same monster.
So why are we still here talking about it? Why didn't it hit us?
Pure, dumb orbital luck. The CME's trajectory missed Earth's orbit by about 9 days. If that eruption had happened just 9 days earlier, the Earth would have been right in the crosshairs.
We were spared by less than 2 weeks. That should be the single loudest wake-up call imaginable.
It should be. We've seen what even milder storms can do. The 1989 storm knocked out power to all of Quebec. And even in May 2024, those storms pushed auroras as far south as Puerto Rico, showing the system is still vulnerable.
So let's talk about the cost. Because when you try to put a dollar figure on a modern recurrence, the numbers just become astronomical.
They really do. The best estimate we have comes from a 2013 study by Lloyd's of London and Atmospheric and Environmental Research. They tried to quantify the cost just to the United States.
Oh, well, what did they find?
The initial estimate was somewhere between $600 billion and $2.6 trillion. If you adjust that for inflation to 2024, you're looking at a range of about $794 billion up to $3.4 trillion.
Over $3 trillion for one country.
And that's not just replacing hardware. That figure represented up to 15.5% of the U.S. annual GDP at the time. A loss on that scale implies not just damage, but a long, crippling economic depression as all the dependent sectors fail.
But it's not just about the grid. The sources highlight this really surprising indirect effect on a sector most people would never connect to space weather: agriculture. This is the real why you should care moment.
This is a crucial insight. The problem isn't the sun hitting the crops, it's industrial dependency. Modern agriculture runs on manufactured inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, that kind of thing.
And those things are made in huge industrial plants that need a massive, steady supply of electricity from the grid.
Precisely. If that grid goes down for months, the factories that make fertilizer shut down. So farmers might have local power, but they can't get the inputs they need to actually grow the crops.
And what does that do to global food production?
The models that looked at this scenario are catastrophic. They projected global crop yields would fall by 38 to 48%.
Nearly half the world's food supply gone. Not because of a drought, but because of an electrical failure.
And in some places, like Central Europe, the projected losses were as high as 75%. This is the cold realization. A Carrington event isn't just a tech problem. It's potentially a mass famine event, simply because our food chain is now tied to a fragile industrial system.
So the lesson isn't just that the sun is powerful, it's that our own interconnectedness has become our greatest vulnerability. Okay, so we've established how bad Carrington was and how devastating a repeat would be. But we have to ask, was that the worst the sun can do? Or is there an even bigger monster lurking in the historical record?
That is the right question. Carrington is the worst storm in our recorded instrument-based history. But to see the full picture, we have to look further back, using proxy data from before the 19th century.
Let's talk about those deep time signatures. How can we possibly find evidence of a solar storm from, say, 1,000 years ago?
We look for specific radioactive isotopes that act as bookmarks in the atmosphere. When a truly massive solar particle event hits Earth, it creates these isotopes, and they get trapped and preserved in natural archives.
And the two main archives are tree rings and ice cores.
Exactly. We look for spikes in carbon-14 in ancient tree rings and beryllium-10 in ice cores. A tree ring captures a snapshot of the atmosphere each year, so it gives us an astonishingly precise timeline.
And when scientists looked at this deep data, they found events that make Carrington look small.
They did. They found signatures for what we now call superstorms. There was a massive one in 774-775 CE and another big one in 993-994 CE.
Let's focus on that 775 CE event. How does that compare to the storm that was setting telegraph poles on fire?
The carbon-14 levels from that event suggest it was about 20 times the normal background variation from the sun. And when you compare it to Carrington, it's estimated to be at least 10 times larger.
10 times larger? What would an event of that magnitude even do to us today?
I mean, it's hard to comprehend. It implies a level of geomagnetic power so far beyond what our grid was built for. The rate of change in the magnetic field would be so fast that any defenses we have would likely be saturated instantly. It could mean near universal transformer failure across the entire sun-facing side of the planet.
And there are hints of even older, even bigger events.
That's right. The proxy data suggests there might have been an even larger event way back in 7176 BCE. The record is constantly showing us that the absolute extremes are way beyond what we've seen in the modern era.
Now, we should inject a note of scientific caution here, right? Especially about some of the early ice core data.
Yes, that's crucial. Early on, some researchers thought that spikes in nitrates in the ice cores were a sign of solar events. The idea was that solar particles would create nitrates in the atmosphere that would then get trapped in the snow.
But that hypothesis didn't quite hold up, did it?
Not entirely. More recent analysis has cast a lot of doubt on it. It seems most of those nitrate spikes are actually from big terrestrial events, like massive forest fires.
And the proof is that the timing doesn't match up globally.
Precisely. If it was a solar event, you'd see the spike in both Greenland and Antarctic ice cores at the same time. But they don't align. So that tells us it was probably a local cause. We have to rely on the more robust proxies like carbon-14.
Speaking of refining the data, let's circle back to Carrington one last time, because recent analysis suggests even that event was more intense than we thought.
This is a brand new finding from 2024. Researchers digitized old magnetogram readings from London, and they looked at the rate of change in the magnetic field. That's the key factor that kills transformers.
And what did they find?
They found field change rates of over 700 nanoteslas per minute. Now, to put that in perspective, our modern grid protections are often designed for a 1 in a 100-year storm, which is defined as around 350 to 400 nanoteslas per minute.
So the Carrington event was actually twice as fast and twice as powerful as our current definition of an extreme storm.
Exactly. The historical data shows that we've actually been understating its power. If a 700-plus nanotesla per minute event hit today, the stress on our grid would be exponentially higher than what we've planned for.
So after all of that, what does this mean for you, the listener? We've gone from a discovery on the sun in 1859 through these incredible historical stories to a potential $3 trillion disaster today.
I think the key takeaways are really clear. The Carrington event was this terrifyingly efficient storm. It was born from the first flare we ever saw and then amplified by that cleared fast lane that let it hit us in under 18 hours. It proved the universe can be beautiful and crippling at the exact same time.
And today, a repeat wouldn't just be a tech crisis. It's an existential threat to the hyper-connected systems that support everything: commerce, finance, even food. We just have so much more to lose now.
And understanding that vulnerability is everything. The knowledge we get from the past, from those 19th century operators and from the deep geological record, that's our best defense. It tells us we need better monitoring, better forecasting, and we need to harden our infrastructure against the true intensity of what the sun can throw at us.
All right. And for that provocative final thought we always like to leave you with, we've talked about the power of Carrington and these even bigger ancient superstorms. But the truth is, the physics of how solar flares generate this much energy isn't totally clear, especially when you compare our sun to other stars out there that produce superflares far, far larger.
And that leaves us with the ultimate question. Is our sun somehow limited? Or is it truly capable of unleashing a storm, say 10 times bigger than Carrington, that could effectively take modern global civilization offline, maybe for a generation? The historical record suggests the latter is entirely possible, and that forces us to consider the ultimate terrifying fragility of our modern connected world.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is the place where we take stacks of technical sources, dense research, and sometimes, let's be honest, the darker corners of human psychology, and really distill them down into the knowledge you need.
And today, we're definitely charting a course right into those darker corners. Our mission is to do a full analysis of the dark triad.
Okay, the dark triad. I think a lot of people have heard the term, but let's unpack it right away. We're talking about a concept that defines 3 specific personality traits. And these aren't necessarily clinical disorders, in the way most people think of them. They're more like deeply offensive character traits that really shape how a person deals with other people.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's a framework, really. This whole idea was formally introduced by a couple of researchers, Delroy Paulus and Kevin Williams, back in 2002.
Yeah.
And they grouped these 3 traits. We're talking Machiavellianism, subclinical narcissism, and subclinical psychopathy, because they all share something fundamental. Malevolent qualities.
Yeah.
And a fundamentally callous and manipulative way of dealing with other people.
So these are the people who put themselves first, no matter what. They find ways to exploit others for their own gain, but they can still, walk among us. They hold down jobs, they lead companies, they have relationships.
They function, but like you said, at a cost to absolutely everyone around them.
And that word subclinical is really important here, isn't it?
It's the key. We are not analyzing people who are institutionalized. We're talking about personality dimensions in the general population, in our coworkers, our neighbors, that make people lean toward this kind of manipulative behavior.
So our mission for this deep dive is, I guess, threefold. First, we have to really break down those 3 traits. We need to get the differences between the narcissist, the Machiavellian, and the psychopath.
Right. And second, we have to look at the real-world impact. Why do these fundamentally negative traits sometimes lead to this sort of startling success, even if it's often very short-lived?
And then finally,
we'll get into the academic debates. Are these 3 things really separate? Where do they come from, genes or environment? And we'll even look at the conceptual opposite, the so-called light triad.
Okay, so by the end of this, the idea is that you, the listener, will have a kind of blueprint for spotting these different manipulative styles.
Exactly. Knowing their playbook is the shortcut you need to better navigate your social and professional world.
All right, let's start with the basics then. Before we pull them apart, what brings these three powerful negative traits together? What's the common ground?
Well, they absolutely share a deep fundamental DNA. The overlap really comes down to three core things.
Okay.
A pervasive lack of empathy, a general sense of interpersonal hostility, and a tendency toward being offensive or antagonistic.
So basically, they're self-centered. Their own needs, their own goals come before anyone else's feelings, rights, or well-being.
That's the engine. It's an exploitative and opportunistic approach to life.
So if that's the underlying engine, why did Polis and Williams even bother to separate them? I mean, if they all share that same dark heart, why not just have one big bad guy dimension?
Because the way the darkness shows up, the strategy they use, their impulse control, their motivation, it's all significantly different.
And those differences matter.
They matter for predicting behavior. Let's start with the one most people think they know, the one that's all about image, narcissism.
We use that term so casually, but here in the Dark Triad, we're talking about subclinical narcissism, so a trait that exists on a spectrum in all of us. What are the key characteristics?
It's all about grandiosity, pride, egotism, a feeling of dominance, entitlement, and of course that central lack of empathy we just talked about.
So they truly believe they are superior, special.
Yes, they operate from that belief. And they have this excessive, almost desperate need for admiration and validation from other people. They can seem really charming and confident at first, but it's often masking a very fragile ego underneath.
So they're the people who always need to be in the spotlight. They're constantly boasting, or they find these subtle ways to steer every conversation back to their own achievements.
You've got it. They need that external validation to prop up that massive self-image.
And when researchers look at this through the lens of the Big Five personality model, where does narcissism sit?
Right, the Big Five. So for our listeners, that's the main framework in personality psychology. Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism.
And narcissism correlates with?
It correlates positively with two of them. Extroversion and openness to experience.
That makes perfect sense. Extroversion would fuel that outward confidence, the need to be social and get attention. And I guess openness relates to their feeling of being unique or maybe more willing to take risks to prove how great they are.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But like the other two traits, it also shows a really strong negative correlation with agreeableness.
Which reflects that hostility and low compassion.
Exactly. And it also has a pretty significant correlation with psychopathy, specifically the more aggressive, bold parts of that trait.
So how do you even measure this in the general population? I imagine the clinical diagnosis for narcissistic personality disorder is intense.
Oh, it is. That requires extensive clinical interviews. But for studying grandiose narcissism in a non-clinical setting, which is the focus of the Dark Triad, the standard tool is the Narcissistic Personality Inventory, or NPI. It's a self-report measure. And it's designed to capture those high-functioning aspects of narcissism, the drive for power, the exhibitionism, the authority. It lets us study this as a dimension in everyday people.
Okay, let's move on to the second member of the trio, Machiavellianism, or high Mox. The name itself, from Niccolo Machiavelli, suggests a cold, calculating approach to power. Is that it? Is it all political maneuvering?
That is the absolute core of it. Machiavellianism is defined by intense manipulativeness, callousness, and a real indifference to morality. High Max are driven by self-interest, and they see relationships as these sort of zero-sum games where manipulation isn't just okay, it's the key to winning at life.
So they don't just manipulate, they genuinely believe the world requires manipulation to get ahead. They're just unprincipled operators.
That's their worldview. And if we look at their Big Five profile, they are, of course, low on agreeableness, but also notably low on conscientiousness.
That's interesting. Why low conscientiousness?
It reflects their sort of strategic but ultimately lazy approach. They'd rather use deceit and find a shortcut through manipulation than do the diligent hard work.
Now, here's the critical question, and I think it's something people really need to grasp. What separates the calculating high Mach from the third trait, psychopathy? They sound similar.
This is the key distinction, and it's what Polis fought to maintain. High Machs are calculating, they plan for the long term, they have incredible behavioral control, they're patient.
And psychopaths are not.
Not at all. They're far less impulsive, reckless, and carelessly aggressive than psychopaths. The Machiavellian is the cold strategist, willing to wait years for the right moment. The psychopath wants their gratification now.
That planning suggests a much higher degree of control. And there's a crucial note here about its academic status, too. It's different from the other two.
Yes, that's a great point. Unlike narcissism and psychopathy, which both have corresponding personality disorders in the DSM.
The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
Right. Machiavellianism has never been in the DSM. It's treated only as a personality construct within psychology. It gives us a slightly different, purely psychological status.
All right, that brings us to the third, and I think arguably the darkest component, psychopathy. This is the one that really gets the most attention.
And for good reason. It's universally considered the most malevolent trait of the Triad. It's defined by a cluster of really profound negative attributes: continuous antisocial behavior, extreme impulsivity, deep selfishness, and these defining callous and unemotional traits.
No remorse.
No remorse. And a very shallow affect.
So if the narcissist wants validation and the high mock wants that slow, strategic win, the psychopath is just driven by pure self-gratification and doesn't care who gets hurt.
That captures the motivation perfectly. They're high in impulsivity, high in thrill-seeking, and they have a real deficiency in experiencing complex emotions like guilt or shame.
Looking at their Big Five profile, I'm guessing low agreeableness again.
Very low agreeableness.
Right.
And crucially, very low conscientiousness. That combination of a lack of basic kindness and a lack of impulse control makes them incredibly volatile.
Measuring psychopathy, even at the subclinical level, that must be a huge challenge.
It is. I mean, historically, the gold standard for clinical assessment was Robert Hare's Psychopathy Checklist Revised, the PCLR.
Right.
But that's an observer-rated tool. It requires tons of training, file reviews, and interview. It's really for forensic populations.
Yeah.
Because, well, asking someone defined by deceit to honestly report on their own callousness is a problem.
Yeah, you can't really rely on the honesty of a person who is defined by their dishonesty.
Exactly. So for researchers studying this in the general population, people who score high on these traits but aren't necessarily criminals, they had to pivot. They moved to self-report tools like the Levinson scales or the psychopathic personality inventory.
Which lets them measure psychopathic attributes on a spectrum.
Precisely. It treats psychopathy as a spectrum, not just a yes or no diagnosis.
Okay, so to sum up part one, we have our trio. The grandiose ego, fueled by status, that's narcissism. The cold calculator seeking long-term strategic gain, that's Machiavellianism.
Right.
And the impulsive, remorseless thrill seeker, that's psychopathy. They're distinct, but they're all united by that core lack of empathy and low agreeableness.
You've got it.
So we've laid the groundwork. Now let's get into the most fascinating part. How do these traits actually function in the real world? And let's start with the ultimate battleground for ambition, the workplace.
Right. Organizational psychology has produced a mountain of research on this, and it confirms that scoring high on the dark triad is genuinely related to acquiring leadership positions.
And even higher salaries.
Yes, and higher salaries and perceived influence. It feeds directly into that cynical idea that, bad guys get ahead.
But you said earlier that the success is often short-lived. Why is that? How does a trait that pushes someone forward eventually cause them to just crash and burn?
That is the central paradox of the dark triad. The very traits that get them noticed are things like superficial charm, assertiveness, dominance. Narcissists, for example, they kill it in interviews because they just project so much confidence.
And the Machiavellians are good at the office politics.
Exactly. They are masters of organizational politics, building these strategic, though very fleeting alliances. These traits open doors. But they lack the essential qualities you need for long-term success.
Like trust, loyalty,
emotional intelligence, genuine conscientiousness. They gain authority by impressing people, but they lose legitimacy by exploiting them.
So the network of support they need to stay in power just collapses.
It erodes over time. The high turnover of staff who can't stand their callousness, the burned bridges, it all eventually catches up to them.
The sources outline this really powerful blueprint for spotting them based on their unique manipulation tactics. How does each trait try to get what it wants?
Yeah, this is fascinating work. Jonathan and his colleagues identified these unique mechanisms. The Machiavellian, the cold calculator, they rely heavily on excessive charm and flattery.
So they make you feel important, and while you're distracted by the praise, they get you to do their dirty work.
That's the classic playbook. Then you have the narcissist, who's all about image and grandiosity. They tend to use their physical appearance or their perceived status to manipulate people.
So it's about dominance. I'm superior, so you should just do what I say.
Exactly. It's much less subtle than the Machiavellian. And finally, the psychopath, the most aggressive and impulsive one, is uniquely related to using physical threats or intimidation.
And that doesn't have to be actual violence, right? It could be explosive outbursts, creating a fearful atmosphere.
Precisely. They rely on fear, not finesse.
That framework, charm, appearance, or threats is incredibly useful. But beyond just climbing the ladder, what's the long-term toxic cost to the organization?
It's profound. All three traits contribute heavily to things like knowledge sabotage and knowledge hiding.
Knowledge hiding. What's that?
It means actively hoarding critical information, delaying giving details, or even intentionally providing false or misleading information to your coworkers. It starves the organization of collaboration.
That's a highly aggressive act disguised as just being forgetful or incompetent.
It's malicious. And research consistently shows that high dark triad bosses negatively affect their subordinates' career success and their well-being. It creates these chronically toxic environments.
And we mentioned narcissists are great at interviews.
Yes, they get more favorable hiring ratings because of their confidence. But that skill rarely translates to better job performance once they're actually hired. They're great at selling themselves, but they often fail to deliver.
Let's transition from the physical office to the digital world. The link between the dark triad and, say, internet trolls seems almost obvious, but what does the research actually show?
This is a huge area of modern study. And yes, the research has firmly established that internet trolls score very high on dark personality traits. We see signs of sadism, antisocial behavior, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism.
The anonymity of the internet must be the perfect playground for them.
It is. It allows these low-empathy, hostile styles to thrive without any immediate social consequences.
You mentioned sadism there, which we hinted might be a fourth trait. How does it connect to trolling specifically?
A key study in 2014 pointed out that trolling is often a manifestation of what they called everyday sadism.
Everyday sadism.
Yeah, the tendency to get genuine pleasure from inflicting pain or distress on others. For these high scorers, the emotional distress they cause online is the reward. It gives them a sense of power and enjoyment.
So it's not just about winning an argument. The cruelty itself is the point.
That's the distinction. Now let's get even more specific and look at actual cybercrime. This is where the functional differences between the traits become crystal clear. Their motivation dictates their attack method.
Okay, so let's take the psychopathic cybercriminal.
Right. Their impulsivity and need for a thrill correlates with faster speeds of persistence and exploitation during an attack. They want the immediate rush of the breach. Speed is more important than stealth.
They're the smash and grab artists of the digital world. What about the narcissist? They need to feel dominant.
Narcissism correlates with a different pattern. Faster privilege escalation, persistence, and extraction. They don't just want to break in. They want the highest possible access, the biggest reward, the most sensitive data.
To prove they're the best.
To validate their superiority. And finally, the calculating Machiavellian, the strategist.
I'm guessing they're all about stealth.
Exactly. Machiavellianism correlates primarily with stealth. They are the digital spies. They want to remain undetected for long-term exploitation, installing backdoors, slowly siphoning data. Their goal is sustained, strategic access.
Wow. That level of detail really confirms these traits are functionally distinct. Okay, let's pivot to the final major area where these traits play out, often dramatically: relationships.
Psychologists have looked at this for decades, and the consensus points to what's called an accelerated mating strategy.
Which is an idea from life history theory, right?
It is. It's a framework that looks at how organisms allocate their energy. The dark triad uses a fast life strategy, focusing on immediate gains in reproduction, rather than a slow life strategy of stability and long-term investment.
So the quantity over quality, basically.
Precisely. People high in dark triad traits report more sex partners, they have very favorable attitudes toward casual sex, and they have significantly lower standards for short-term mates.
They're built for transactional interactions.
They're masters of it. They're also more willing to actively poach mates from other people, since relationships are just seen as a resource to be acquired.
So in terms of their dating patterns, what does that look like?
They gravitate heavily toward relationship types that allow for high turnover and low emotional investment. So one-night stands, hookups, booty calls, friends with benefits.
Right.
Their style of romance is pragmatic and game-playing. They're amazing at the initial seduction. They seem highly desirable. But once the immediate goal is met, that lack of empathy becomes very apparent very quickly.
And what happens if a relationship, against all odds, tries to become long-term or stable?
It rarely works. They are significantly less likely to sustain long-lasting relationships. They report drastically lower relationship satisfaction, and they're far more willing to just end things.
Their opportunism and emotional shallowness just can't sustain a real partnership.
Exactly. The partner eventually burns out or realizes they're just being used. It's a profound demonstration that while these traits are great for short-term acquisition, they're catastrophic for long-term cooperation.
Be it in the office or in the bedroom. Okay. As dynamic as the core three are, the research is always evolving. And this led to the idea of a dark tetrad. What's the proposed fourth trait, and why did academics feel it was necessary?
The proposed fourth trait is sadism. And the argument for including it is that while sadism is highly correlated with the core three, especially psychopathy, it uniquely predicts antisocial behavior above and beyond what the other three can predict.
So what specific behavior does sadism account for that the others don't cover?
Sadism is fundamentally about deriving actual pleasure or enjoyment from cruelty, from inflicting suffering or pain.
Ah, okay.
The distinction is crucial. A psychopath might hurt someone to get their wallet, but they don't necessarily enjoy the pain itself. Sadism distinctively predicts unprovoked aggression, cruelty for its own sake.
So the dark triad is exploitation for gain, but sadism is exploitation for fun.
That's a very concise way to put it. Now let's look at an alternative grouping that kind of flips the script. The vulnerable dark triad, or VDT. This seems almost counterintuitive to the bold, assertive style we've been describing.
Right, we've been talking about these grandiose extroverts. What defines the VDT?
The VDT is made up of vulnerable narcissism, secondary psychopathy, which is often linked to high anxiety and borderline personality traits. Unlike the traditional dark triad, VDT members are characterized by negative emotionality, distrust, and volatility.
And they're more introverted.
Yes, significantly related to introversion and profound emotional disinhibition. So while the traditional dark triad is the outward dominant bully, the VDT is more like the internal, emotionally reactive, fragile antagonist.
And what drives them is different.
Completely. The traditional dark triad is influenced by external factors, how they choose to act to get what they want. The VDT is driven by internal, embedded desires and deep emotional insecurity. Their antagonism comes from anxiety and poor self-regulation, not from a place of bold superiority.
Shifting gears now, we have to talk about the big academic debate here. Are these three traits truly distinct, or are psychologists just naming the same shade of darkness three different ways?
This is the heart of the criticism. It's often summarized by the term jangle fallacy, using different names for what is essentially the same underlying thing.
And the argument is that the theoretical differences just don't show up in the data.
Exactly, especially when you're studying the general population. The overlap is most pronounced between Machiavellianism and psychopathy. In practice, researchers really struggle to find self-report questions that measure pure strategic callousness that don't also capture parts of psychopathy, and vice versa.
So in a college sample, scoring high on a Machiavellianism scale might just be a proxy for measuring subclinical psychopathy.
That's one of the major conclusions some researchers have reached. And we even see this convergence when you look at the clinical gold standard, the PCLR. A lot of the content about manipulation and superficial charm is housed in what's called Factor 1 of that test, which some have even dubbed aggressive narcissism, again showing this massive statistical convergence.
So the distinction Paulus and Williams drew, while it sounds good in theory, might be too subtle for our current measurement tools.
That's the technical challenge. But regardless of that debate, the shared foundation is undisputed. And we see that clearly when we map the triad back onto the Big Five model.
What's the single unifying factor there?
Across hundreds of studies, the strongest single correlate of the entire dark triad is consistently low agreeableness.
That makes sense.
It captures the suspicion, the antagonism, the hostility, the coldness that they all share. They are all at their core low on the compassion dimension. That low agreeableness is the dark gravitational center.
That really grounds it in a solid scientific model. Okay, so where do these traits come from? Nature or nurture?
The classic question. To answer that, researchers rely on twin studies, which help us parse out the contributions of genetics versus environment.
And what did they find?
All three traits, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, have substantial genetic components. A lot of the overlap we see between them is driven by inherited genes.
But are they all equally heritable?
Interestingly, no. Psychopathy and narcissism were found to be statistically more inheritable than Machiavellianism.
Wow. So the impulsive aggression of the psychopath and the grandiose ego of the narcissist are more locked in by DNA, while Machiavellianism might be more malleable.
That's the interpretation. While unique life events, what we call non-shared environmental factors, contribute to all three, Machiavellianism is the only one of the three found to be related to environmental factors that are shared with siblings.
The family environment.
The family environment, exactly.
That's a critical finding. It suggests that Machiavellianism, the cold, calculating part, is the trait most likely to be influenced by your early family dynamics.
Yes. Some researchers think that the strategic, manipulative behavior of a high Mach might be a learned coping mechanism from a difficult family structure, where they learn that deceit and manipulation are necessary tools for survival.
That gives the high Mach this chilling, almost tragic backstory that the impulsive psychopath or the entitled narcissist might lack. It's the learned behavior of a survivor.
That's a powerful idea.
We've spent a lot of time in the dark. Before we wrap up, let's look at the mirror image. Psychologists proposed a corresponding light triad.
This is a vital and, I think, hopeful shift in focus. It was developed by Scott Barry Kaufman and his colleagues to define traits that promote positive interpersonal functioning and genuine cooperation.
So what are the three components of this light side?
They are humanism, Kantianism, and faith in humanity.
Okay, let's break those down. Humanism.
Humanism is about valuing the dignity and self-worth in others, treating them with respect just because they're human.
And Kantianism, named after the philosopher Immanuel Kant.
Yes, and this is the most direct contrast to the dark triad's core. Kantianism means seeing other people as ends in themselves, not just as means to an end.
So not using people as tools to get what you want.
Exactly. And the third is faith in humanity. It's just a general, optimistic belief that other people are fundamentally good and trustworthy. A stark contrast to the cynicism of the high Mach.
And what are the real-world outcomes for people who score high on this light triad?
The list is extensive and overwhelmingly positive. They report much higher life satisfaction, more compassion, empathy, self-esteem, a real sense of authenticity.
They sound like great people to be around.
They are. They're intellectually curious, tolerant, they have secure relationships, they have what's often called a quiet ego, confident, but not demanding validation.
It sounds like a blueprint for a fulfilling life. But you mentioned there might be a trade-off, a potential weakness.
This is the interesting twist.
Oh.
While overwhelmingly positive, the light triad traits were found to be uncorrelated with certain characteristics like bravery or assertiveness.
So, while they're compassionate, they might struggle to stand up for themselves or confront injustice.
That's the idea. Their focus on cooperation might mean they lack the competitive edge or the necessary self-assertion to achieve really challenging goals. Their quiet ego might leave them susceptible to being exploited by the very dark triad types we've been talking about.
It suggests that maybe optimal functioning requires a balance, a bit of that assertiveness or grit.
It does seem that way.
This has been a really comprehensive look at the architecture of these offensive personalities. To quickly synthesize, the dark triad is three distinct but overlapping traits: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, all united by that profound lack of agreeableness.
We saw how their motivations dictate their strategies, leading to these real but usually short-lived advantages in leadership and mating. And we touched on the critical academic debate, the jangle fallacy, but affirmed that low agreeableness is that undisputed gravitational center.
We also found that genes play a strong role, but Machiavellianism seems to be the one most shaped by environment, possibly learned in difficult family situations. And finally, we contrasted all this darkness with the hopeful but maybe not so assertive light triad.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We have to connect this to another model of personality, the Exoxico model, which includes a sixth factor: honesty, humility.
Okay.
The dark triad is profoundly and strongly negatively correlated with sincerity, fairness, modesty, and avoiding greed. The take-home message is that any benefits from these traits, the job, the partners, are conferred only on the person with the traits, not on society, not on the people around them.
It's the ultimate selfish zero-sum strategy.
Correct. So knowing this blueprint is your critical shortcut. When you're dealing with difficult people, you now have the tools to analyze their manipulative mechanism. Is this person using excessive charm and flattery to get their way? That's likely Machiavellianism.
Are they relying on their physical appearance or their status to dominate the room?
That's narcissism.
Or are they defaulting to physical threats, intimidation, or just explosive volatility to get compliance.
That's the psychopath's playbook. Understanding which dark style you're facing is the essential knowledge you need to predict and manage the self-interested behaviors of those around you.
Knowledge is power, especially when you're navigating the darker corners of human nature. You now know the difference between the cold calculator, the entitled ego, and the thrill seeker.